also. These are sites of high ecological pressure, and large-scale reclamation and dredging for making the systems navigable have already caused a lot of significant destruction of mangroves, which are important from ecological perspective as well as disaster management perspectives. So this basically the key idea would be to approach the waterways development not just from a transport perspective but also from a climate resilience point of view, which can provide city a lot of advantages beyond navigation. Unless and until that's done, the water metro project or whatever the projects that's happening won't be won't bring the economic resilience which is much needed in the city. I would like to request Utkarsh to make the presentation.
Thanks, Sandeep. Thanks, Dr. Tewari. Dr. Ahluwalia, it's my honor. So this one's not a city-specific study; it's a pan-India study. We had after 16 years the new solid waste management rules. These rules mainly say that the rules now are beyond the scope of just the municipal corporation. It goes far beyond that. There are several studies with several different estimates of solid waste generated in India. We estimate the generations to be somewhere between 64 million tons to 72 million tons per annum for the year 2017. Of course, with the rise in urban population, the generation is bound to rise. Here are the city-wise waste generation. Larger cities, not just owing to their population, but higher per capita generation have higher waste generation per annum. Composition. The last reliable study which gave composition of solid waste was in 2014 by Kasturi Rangan Committee. It says that around 51% of the waste in the country is biodegradable. We believe, and the international experience says that it's bound to be much higher than what we estimate. It should be around 60% something. And again, we can see that larger cities perform very poorly in terms of door-to-door collection and source segregation, whereas smaller cities like Tirunelveli, Suryapet have much better statistics in these regards. Here's a list of composting plants across the country. It's 2016 list. As we can see that only 14% of the capacity installed in the country is operational, which is meagerly very low. And capacity itself is much less than what's required. Similar is the case for biomethanation plants. Some cities like Pune and Bangalore experimented with larger biomethanation plants, but they struggled with several operational difficulties, and therefore they could not perform up to their marked capacity. RDF plants, the new rules 2016 says that if every industry which needs fuel, solid fuel like coal, should replace 5% of its input by RDF located within 100 kilometers from its periphery. But given the poor segregation levels, it's very difficult to get high calorific value RDF, and therefore processing that RDF makes it competitive to the cheap coal that's available. Therefore, the RDF manufacturers in the country find it very difficult to sell their RDF. Hence, they perform much at a capacity much lower than their marked capacity. Waste to energy plants. Delhi's Okhla plant is of course very famous. It's one of the very first plants. Waste to energy plants operate near their capacity owing to several reasons. First is that we can put in the waste that's generated just like that, but given again poor segregation levels and the presence of higher organic content in this in our waste, it makes these waste to energy plants difficult to operate. So therefore a lot of pre-processing is done for that waste to increase its calorific value, which jeopardizes their finances. So we here have environmentally unsustainable solid waste management. It's basically that we consume without regard for resource conservation, and mixing of dry waste with wet waste hampers its recyclability, and most of it which goes to the landfill sites ends up generating methane. It's a list of landfill sites. And as we can see that thousands of kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions come out from landfill sites from our cities. So for sustainable solid waste management, first we should there should be less consumption and more of the reuse. Often recycling is underestimated, but it offsets a large amount of associated emissions, because we don't need to extract new material from resources. Then composting, biomethanation, and other recovering methods like RDF and waste to energy are also good mitigation options. Bioremediation of legacy waste accumulated at dump sites is where we can save the space at landfill sites, and also maybe recover some recyclables lying at landfill sites. Is a very frugal option, and it's a very good mitigation method that can be adopted. To make the business of waste management financially sustainable is also equally important. Dr. Ahluwalia knows very well the financial status of the ULBs in the country is not very well. Their revenues have been in downward trend since long, and a World Bank study suggests that only 15 to 25% of the total municipal revenue spent on solid waste management, and of that 90% accounts to collection and transportation, which leaves a very meager amount for processing of the solid waste. The Swachh Bharat mission is a good first step, but downstream processing of waste after collection is not being much talked about here. There are certain issues, like for example, the solid waste rules mandate that fertilizer companies should also co-market compost along with the fertilizers, but the chemical fertilizers being heavily subsidized make the compost uncompetitive, which is rendered costlier because of the subsidies. Biomethanation plants, because the waste is not segregated, makes them difficult to operate. Waste to energy plants, I discussed that because again it's not segregated, and therefore because of the low calorific value, it's difficult to sustain on them. It's difficult for the plants to sustain on themselves, and therefore they need either auxiliary fuel or power purchase agreements at higher than the market rate. Bioremediation is a very frugal method, as I told earlier, and it should be seen forward to resolve the problem of legacy of waste. And of course, there's recycling, which has several of studies have told that's highest offsetting potential in terms of waste management. That's about it. Thank you.
I know we are running very behind. Sorry about that. And everybody has been very patient. We'd love to engage in a conversation now with a panel of guests that we've invited. And I just wanted to invite them here to the table. And we would also maybe as they come and sit here, once they come and sit here, maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions from you, which we won't necessarily answer exactly in the moment, but the panel could consider. and think about the kinds of things that you're thinking about. So I wanted to first invite Dr. Usha Raghupathy to join us at the table. She's a professor at NIUA, New Delhi, and an urban planner with over 33 years of professional experience in this sector. She has a degree in geography from Delhi University and a diploma, graduate diploma in planning from Ahmedabad. And she's been very active in the urban climate change and the green growth areas recently, and has also been involved in evaluations and appraisals, which is a way to understand what's happening on the ground. And these are of Jane and RUM and other programs, and she's widely published. Welcome. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. G.K. Bhatt. He's chairman of Taru Leading Edge, which is a very, very active institution in this area that we've been talking about all morning. And he has 30 years of experience in, issues of risk and hazards and vulnerability assessment in South Asia and abroad. He's done a lot of work in Gujarat and in all the cities that we talked about, Pune as well. And over the last 5 years, he has been working extensively on climate change and risk assessment, and was very involved with the Rockefeller program in Surat and Indro. Welcome, glad you could be here. And I'd like to turn to Amit. Amit is here with us from the Rockefeller Foundation, and he is India head of the 100 Cities program with them, and he manages other aspects at the Rockefeller Foundation as well, and he's representing the institution. He has a background in architecture, in urban planning, from MIT as well as SPA here and from UMass Amherst, and has been also working on the ground before he joined the Rockefeller Foundation. So welcome, delighted to have you here. And Divya Sharma, who was our fourth panelist, is down with a cold, not cold, but flu, so she apologizes, and we of course miss her. Maybe I will maybe I'll stand here. I don't know how we will do it. I would have loved to have Dr. Ahluwalia join us as well, and you can intervene as you wish, and in fact push the panel to talk about what cities can do differently. But the broad issue that we wanted to start with was that everything that we've discussed this morning, a lot of it is sort of goals and ideals, things that we would love to see happen. But the reality on the ground is that it's as good as the implementation capacity of our institutions. And they are weak, and we've discussed that at no end, the planning institutions and the planning processes, the devolution and so forth is so incomplete. And then there are different actors, like there are urban planners, there are policymakers, regulators, everybody may be doing their own thing. And as we saw this afternoon from all the cases as well, it's so important to come together, but it's easier said than done. So we wanted to go around and sort of elicit some insights from your experience, and you can certainly relate to whatever it is that we talked about, to maybe help us think differently. And as Dr. Bhatt said, I'll let you say it yourself, that how do we think differently? We've done a lot of stuff at small scales, in fragmented ways. Is there a way we can learn from it as we go forward? So that's sort of the broad agenda. There are lots of other things that we can talk about. But if you wouldn't mind, could we take a few questions, that maybe 3 questions that the audience has in mind that we'll keep on the table, and then, because I wanted to bring you into the conversation as well. So is that okay with the group, just to hear what you're thinking about? Any 3 observations or questions? So, yeah. Go ahead.
I have one question that...
You can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Dinesh Sharma. I'm a freelance journalist. You made a passing reference to the problem of slums in the city, but this is a bigger problem. Slums are bigger problem than anything else. And to deal with natural disaster or this kind of thing, unless there is improvement in slums, most of Delhi, 60% of Delhi is slums. So how do you deal with this problem?
Great. So we'll have that on the table. Thank you. Yes.
Any research would set its limits. No? So I'm sure you must have set limits as well for this research. But climate is something where you can't have limits. So how do we deal with that? And particularly when I hear urban, rural as separate, I'm a bit I have a discomfort with that. So because the design of entry points could be much further than the city. And we did hear little bit mention in the water related interventions that there is something in the hinterland and so. But how do you deal with that? I'm Sarabjit. I work with UNICEF in India.
Great, thank you. And okay, we'll take one.
Okay. I'm Professor Jindal from MIT University in Environmental Sciences. For economic resilience in changing climate, I was looking at this. I think we are missing the angle of air pollution, which is impacting global warming and climate change in terms of the cities and Delhi being named as the most polluted. So that is my request to put some light on that.
How do we bring
also.
that into
Yes,
the picture?
yes. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And okay, the last two questions, and then we'll turn.
My name is V.K. Krishna. I am from MIT University, but my profession is forestry. But as I look to it, the whole basic issue is the land use planning, and that is where we are very much lacking. It is only on paper. If you talk about the water bodies everywhere are just being, you talk about the trees, for widening of the road, and the plantation which is being done. Is a very sorry state of affairs, because about the selection of trees, about the old trees, they stored the carbon, and when you replant it, it takes about 10-15 years. Of course, I am aware of the fact that a vigorously growing trees, takes much more carbon than an old tree. But when you fell an old tree, the mass of carbon is huge. So all these calculations, all these planning do not come in the urban planning. And the tree planting has become a public domain. So in my opinion, lot of training, lot of awareness, lot of education is required in this area.
Great, thank you. All right, the last two questions, and then
Just a small point, I think. Okay, my name is Manjeet Singh, and I work for the World Health Organization in India office. So just carrying forward the point what Sarabjit said in terms of diminishing the urban-rural boundaries, and I'm kind of taking it also in terms of diminishing the institutional boundaries as well, and how the panel can focus on the intersectoral kind of collaboration, because we have been talking about a lot on, especially on climate issues or air pollution issues, a lot on intersectoral, but how we can kind of really demonstrate that. So just a point on that. Thank you.
A.K. Jain, I am a town planner and has been on some committees of the Ministry of Urban Development. So my question is that, first of all, I should compliment the ICRIER for taking such a important issue, and really I am happy that this is a very good research work, genuine research work, which is taking place. But my worry is that how we translate this research into the practice, because what is happening is that we don't have a proper legal backup, we don't have the finances, we don't have the institutional thing. So when you are talking the panel, please please make sure, please touch upon how we mainstream and embed this climate change into our process, whether it's planning or a sustainable development process. Thank you.
great. Thank you very much. I think it gives us a real sense from everybody that, what are some troubling issues. So I think I'll let you open, and maybe we can just go around initially with your, whichever direction you'd like to move, and, a few, 2-3 minutes of observation, then we can have an interaction.
Yeah, the points made are very valid. Let me, as an urban planner, talk about land use planning first. I think when we talk of climate change and we look at all the aspects, I think land use planning has a very important role. And at least the time I studied, which was ages ago, there was absolutely no thinking on the environment and these kind of aspects as we look at it now. But today we have these schools of planning which look at land use planning, which do talk of climate change, put in the climate change angle. But I'm not sure to what extent they are looking at really integrating all the aspects into planning. But one part is actually planning, which we are now talking of looking at the gradients and basin-wise planning, because we have this issue of flooding of cities. But also what actually happens on the ground, because one is planning, which probably, if you look at it, probably would still be good. But in reality, what actually happens is it all changes, as we know. And there are all kinds of pressures from all kinds of directions, and ultimately, the maybe a beautiful plan doesn't really remain that, and maybe it was well thought out, well researched, and a lot of input goes into it. But the pressures of the city and the politics and so on, it just changes the course of this. So yes, we do need better planning, but we also need better implementation and thinking that goes into it. Slums, of course, are the areas we need to concentrate on, because I think like somebody, when making a presentation, talked about Surat, that they really started off from low-income areas. So I think it's very important that we look at the low-income areas and the problem that they have, because while we may kind of isolate them, or maybe the people who think that they should look at the better off areas, but the interconnectedness of the city with these places, our drivers, maids, and all kinds of services come from these places, and if these places have problems, it may just enter our own households also. So we really need to look at this. We cannot ignore one part of our city. It's like our whole body. We cannot ignore one part of the body. So really looking at the city as a whole, this is a very important part. And I think cities that are more aware are really looking at this and seeing how to solve their problems. And the separation of rural and urban areas, I think that's a very important part. I mean, I come from the National Institute of Urban Affairs, and we've been really looking at the urban areas. But certainly, one realizes that in certain aspects, certainly the climate change aspect, the two cannot be separated, because it's a global thing, it's a national thing, it's a regional, and much beyond the boundaries of the cities. And I think when anybody working on climate change issues, I think is looking at the larger picture, because like I think one of the presenters said that even if you downscale it, you can't come to the city exact. So it is really the region, a larger area that you look at. And there, I think there is going to be that integration. But definitely we need to create institutions that will look at both rural and urban areas. I think when we had this 74th Amendment, we were looking at the metropolitan areas, but maybe large regional areas, and there are these development authorities which are there. So we need to really look at the larger area than city, because, and that goes into the interconnectedness of the institutions, because we cannot separate rural, urban, or different sections of or departments. But also, what happens is, if the interconnectedness in terms of the whole country, if the city is suffering today, it may not be just because the city has a problem, but because all the areas around have a problem. So we really need to look at that. And we need to break the institutional barriers where we realize that all the departments, all the agencies need to come together. And I think that one very small example is Surat, which people talked about. It is beautifully connected. All the departments work very well together. And I think if that example, if it's taken of how they have come together and how they work together, I think it can be scaled up, and maybe other cities can replicate the same.
I think, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think it's a really rich discussion, and it starts to highlight, what is the challenges with urban resilience. I think we keep using climate change, but I'll go back to the word urban resilience, because I think that's really the fundamental agenda that Rockefeller has been trying to promote all along. Climate change is part of that agenda. And the reason I emphasize that is because it's very hard, even for us in this room, if I start to ask you, what is climate change and what is the impact that's going to be felt in a city, I'm sure even in this room there'll be a discussion about what that actually means. And we're talking about cities that, I think has been highlighted, don't have capacities to even understand. And they're busy solving their current problems and current issues. And when we add the word climate change next to it, it freaks out people, right? I mean, it's hard to understand. But I think that's where the link that you have started to show today between the economic impact or the economic risks and addressing those economic risks, which primarily cities are, that's one of their primary functions for city government is, how do I grow my economy? And to that, if we can make the link to the risks and start to show them, if your slums is where the problem is because there are the workers are coming from there, and if it's a flood and your worker can't reach the industry, you have a productivity loss. You have to look at that issue, and that also looks at mobility, right? So and that goes back to land use planning, because the decisions as government that you're making, okay, in Chennai, most of your high-tech park is located in a floodplain area, and we saw from Bangkok. In 2011, after the major flood, there was a global supply chain impact because of that one flood, because the industries were located again in the floodplains. But it's very hard for local governments to understand those linkages. And I think that's where 100 Resilient Cities, it's a program that Rockefeller Foundation set up in 2013, trying to raise the ambition a little bit. So it was trying to say, okay, let's see how we can bring about institutional change. So it's no longer about a project. It's no longer about climate change, but it's about raising, basically, institutional change, because that's where the fragmentation in government. That's where your point about how do you get non-governmental entities part of the conversation, private sector part of the conversation. So it was how do you bring about that institutional change, and 100RC was set up to look at that across 100 cities. We are now 5 years into the program, and I would encourage you, there is a report that has just come out by Urban Institute that's done an evaluation of this 100RC program, and it's pretty honest. We've been successful in some parts and not in others. And in India, we're looking at Chennai, Surat, Pune, and Jaipur. And Dr. Bhatt was part of the Surat engagement from 100RCs. The city has a resilience strategy. The city established the chief resilience officer, try to again highlight resilience. And I can argue with him, but it's not gone very far, right? I mean, so there are certain aspects of resilience, and I saw linkages with what was talked about on the water security side, because the city, with our help, has been able to get additional funding to look at the River Tapi, long-term integrated vision for River Tapi to clean up from a water supply security point of view. So there was already some appetite to look at that issue, and with additional funding, they're saying, okay, now we need to think about this long term. So I think going back to the points that you're making, they're all very valid points, but each is going to be has to be looked at in the context of that particular city. In Chennai, for example, where I do a lot of work, Chennai is again flat like Kochi is, right? So you've got a lot of water bodies, and the water bodies are getting lost to urbanization. I mean, after the 2015 flood, there is definitely a very strong awareness amongst the government. They have to do something. They're doing a lot of things. Vikram Kapoor, they've had some really good leadership. It's still fragmented institutionally. It's got the state involved, it's got the city involved, it's got politics, that whole. But even through that, there is a growing recognition that we need to change how we're looking at water systems. And I can talk later at the end a little bit about some of the innovations we're trying on the ground in Chennai. I won't give you an answer saying that slums, all of your points are very valid, and I don't think there's a clear solution how to bring that about yet. And I think that is the challenge for all of us, is the complexity has to be broken down by people in this room, for the people on the ground who are implementing it, to be able to understand the linkages, which are often not understood. I'll stop there and then.
I'll come from, one is the whole problem sets, and then look into what we can do. Okay, some of the problems you raised already, the slums, okay, whole boundary things, okay, about air pollution, land use planning, and town planning, and whole lot of things. The root problem of any climate change related intervention is to have information about climate change. How much is the climate change? I'll give an example. In under ICRIER, we asked a meteorologist to give me, the all meteorological parameters. So there is nothing called urban meteorology in this country, okay? So the people don't know. So they get the averages and what is the changing averages and all. But actually in urban areas, the whole meteorology is about extremes. Whether it is the temperature extreme, whether the rainfall extreme, or whether it is the flood extreme, or sea level rise, that is of course hydrology sort of thing. So unfortunately in our whole planning curriculum, neither meteorology is taught, not urban geology is taught, nor urban hydrology is taught. If you look into open the master plan, you virtually find nothing about these three subjects. And these are the critical things to, and as I say, whole ecology, urban ecology also is an important thing. I forgot that up. I've just put 4 things at least are required, at least the basics every planner should know. Unfortunately, that's absent. Okay, coming back to, this is the one thing, whole capacity building of our, younger generation to face the climate change, and also the municipalities and rest of the people. Second, coming back to the slums, I was just remembering Patrick Geddes' work of 1935 of Indro and other cities he did. He called something called conservative surgery. How do you, actually it is being done in many, South American cities. How do you open up the slums? How do you, you have huge opportunities in slums because they're all mostly single story, maximum 2-story things. If you're actually taking it up slightly higher, you can actually release a lot of land for putting the infrastructure. So this is exactly what Patrick Geddes was talking about in 1935. He visited something like 8 or 10 cities across India. And one of the things which he was talking about is, I think it's very worth revisiting conservative surgery from the slums. Then we're talking about climate limits. See, when you're talking about climate limits, there are 2 things. One is uncertainties. One is known, okay, temperature will increase. When it comes to rainfall, there is a lot of variations. You are not very certain about climate change. How, whether it's increasing, or whether it's decreasing, or whether it's extreme rainfall is increasing, whole lot of things. They are the indirect second level impacts. First is the carbon dioxide increase, second is the temperature, third becomes slightly vague of rainfall and all, and sea level rise and all. There is uncertainties increase. And we are going to have a lot of surprises. Both we have to be planning for. Both uncertainties and surprises. Then comes the whole question of boundaries. Okay, there is we wrote a book, 8 years of work, 2 books we wrote. The second book was called Synergy for Sustainable Cities. The whole argument is on 3 things. One is across scales we should be able to plan. It is not the city, it is actually the hinterland which is giving you all your resources. Water supply is coming from somewhere. Flood also is coming from somewhere. So we need to be able to see across the scales. And even the interventions, we need to see across scales. The whole photovoltaic, whatever, the rooftop solar, if you say municipality to put in, it is not going to work. It is every household has to think about it, so that, no, I will give my, rooftop for this. So then one is the scales. How do you think about scales? And what things can be done across scales? Some things have to be done at a community level, decentralized, recycling, a whole lot of circular economy, everything has to happen at a colony or a ward level. Second is the whole sectors, the whole water is dealt as three separate subjects: water supply, sewerage, and stormwater drainage. How do you combine? To some places, Surat has done some work on it. How do you combine it up and down? So whole recycling, everything comes in this thing. So the across sectors, you have to, same way, you have to look into transportation and water, okay, lighting and water, electricity and water. So the whole intersectoral thinking is required. It is not that we are planning electricity separately, water separately, or this thing. We need to look into what are the synergies between the sectors. Third thing is the stakeholders. Municipalities promise everything, but they are unable to deliver even 50% of what they are supposed to do, unfortunately. They either don't have the funds, they don't have the capacities, they don't have the staff, whole lot of things are there. We need to be looking into solutions. If you are talking about circular economy, if you are looking into cross-scalar interventions, we need to be really looking into other stakeholders. So one of the real good works on this, on climate change and sociology, is done by a guy called Michael Thompson. I think, madam, we really should see that. It's called cultural theory. Cultural theory puts all the people into 4 groups, depending upon grid and group. Grid is what is imposed on us. Group is how do we join together. So grid group, you put in 4 these things, you get positive, 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 negative, this thing. So there are 4 types of people, institutions. Okay. First is the government, which is very hierarchical and strong capacity to control. Okay. High grid, high group. 2 communities which are highly gridded, like common man on the street. He is like highly gridded. He is like caste and everything that is coming in this thing, and very low group capacity. The worst is the laborers. The laborers in the addas, you can see them. It is a 0 group and very highly gridded. Then you have the civil society and all those people who are got a highly grouping and no grid. And a private sector, all no grid, no group. Okay. So I think, these 4 types of stakeholders have to be involved. That's what whole Michael Thompson's argument has been, and distinction. I can send you that paper. Unless you engage these people, no one organization doing all the things is going to fail. That's the whole thing is, municipality doing everything is not going to work out. How do you bring it? I think, the donors and everybody has to be really looking into those partnerships, Where are those partnerships? I'll give you 2 fantastic examples of partnership where it worked. Private sector, I was just talking to Professor Mathur. He said private sector, they can't do anything. The whole water quality problem by RO system that has come to every household is totally by the private sector. Household filters, if they were not there, we would be still having cholera and whole lot of waterborne diseases. Same thing that's happening today with a huge private sector engagement is the rooftop solar. No government would have been able to push the rooftop solar. Community, it is actually a fantastic partnership between government, community and the private sector. Otherwise it would not have been possible. So that is one part. We need to be really looking into these 4 types of partnerships. Then the whole thing about what I am increasingly thinking about is, if you have to push the climate change resilience, we require 3 things. One is the information. This is the root thing. If you don't have the information, you can't convince anybody, you are going to have increased rainfall, your temperatures are going to be like that. You require really decentralized information. Actually, we are trying this experiment in Calcutta with the ADB project. We are monitoring, we are putting around 450 sensors which monitor the pumps, which monitor the rainfall, then pumps, then canals, then streets. And because it was a flood monitoring project, we added up 2 more elements to it, the temperature and humidity and air pollution. So we're getting around 80 sensors across the city, which is better than even in Delhi. Okay, so street sensors which are getting the data on a real time. I can just open my mobile and see what is happening. And the whole lot of value addition that is possible with that. So I think the information is the first thing. So more information you have, you can take a more informed decisions. It can go into planners, it can go into actually implementation and management. Second is the innovations. All our 100 cities are 100 different types. Okay, there is no 2 cities are same. Okay, the contexts are different. Kolkata is like mayor is very powerful. And you go to Surat, it is a commissioner who is powerful. And commissioner is changed every 3 years. So the priorities changed. Uska, whatever khayal is there, somebody comes with the slum improvement, somebody comes with water supply. Third thing, there is no continuity. So each city we need to have a fantastic context analysis. In what context? In what geophysical context, hydrological context, ecological context, social context and economic context. Unless we have this, we can't plan anything. So that is the whole information requirement. Second is, how do we innovate? This context analysis should actually help us innovate. What is the solutions which you can, what is actually the leeway we have got, where is the entry point and how do we work? This can happen only. Third thing is the investment and infrastructure. So that is like, if we don't do the first 2, third one cannot be done. I think all investment should come only after these 2. Okay, information and innovation, whatever possible. So I think smart cities, we missed a huge chance of just repeating the same water supply and sanitation. This thing, they should have really built a city information infrastructure. It would have been very cheap. It was doable, and that would have become a stepping stone to do rest of the improvements. So instead they fell back into JNURM style, so they will probably end up in more buses, like what JNURM did, sorry to say. Okay. Then the third thing is, in the context, when you are doing all this analysis, we need to think, we are talking about 2030 population. The world is going to change like mad. We can't understand. It's a jobless world. So we need to be really thinking about how to diversify, how to... Surat, I have a fear that what will happen to that city, because everything depends upon 2. What is it? Diamond and textiles. If there is no third thing there, if you don't diversify, okay, you're gone. So all economic, whatever resilience comes from diversification. Okay, that's all.
This is on. I think we can take one more round of comments. I think what I hear in all the comments that everybody has made is that there are real planning tensions that are always going to be with us if we think about implementation, right? So how do we find concrete ways, or what have you seen from concrete examples where, we can't wish away those kinds of, that messiness. And so what are some ways around it? When does it actually happen from cases you've all actually seen? That's one. And the second is that, the other thing that has come through in your comments is that when we talk about institutional innovation or these other things, there is a degree of intentionality that we are imputing to it, that we need to know that we want to do that. But without intentionality, we can't even get certain outcomes. Like it can't be accidental that we build equity in. It has to be intentional. It has to be part of how we design, but it never works out really like that. So these conundrums that we have to have a vision, but we know it's never going to work out quite that way. But the deliberative ways in which we can still stay on track, what are some examples that you have seen from real cases that shed some light on what we can do differently?
I think, at least in India and maybe in other parts, the greatest learning is from disaster. Unless disaster strikes, we don't really learn, because we may have plans, we may want to do, but nobody does it until disaster strikes. And I think city after city, we can see that what has led to change is actually experiencing disaster. And no amount of information sharing. I mean, all the cities know that there could be a problem, but because there could be a problem and there isn't a problem today, they don't really necessarily take action because they don't see it. A very good example, I think I'll just give two examples. Two of my colleagues had gone to Srinagar in 2015, I think, and they had spoken to the commissioner, and they said, what are you doing about climate change? You could have a problem, maybe floods. They said, what floods? We hardly get any monsoon rain. And the moment they came back, there were floods. Similarly, when we were doing a training for our local government officials, in Surat, we had invited local government officials from Ujjain also, and we were talking about climate change and how cities should be prepared. And they said, oh, we don't have any problem. The moment they went back, Ujjain was flooded. So, we cannot predict, and no city wants to take action because it has not happened. Because building resilience or taking action is a long-term process. It has to start with probably land use planning, and it has to go into every aspect, like what Surat has done, and departments have to come together. But I think a very big part of it is what I would call capacity building, and capacity building will have many, many aspects to it. But capacity building not just of the officials, but of the elected representatives. I think it's extremely important that we look at the political class, who again would look at their tenure, term to term, and they want to achieve maximum within their given term. And these things like climate change, unless disaster befalls them, they are not thinking of long-term problems and integrating them into plans. So I think capacity building has to be a big part. And when I say capacity building, it can be awareness, it can be actual training, it can be a city-to-city visit, it can be technical, it can be just about anything. But both officials and elected representatives need to be made aware, told what are the kind of problems that one could have. It's because today the city has not been impacted by it, doesn't mean that tomorrow it will not be impacted by it. And, sorry. And I always give this example to people when I'm training. I ask them if they've taken a life insurance policy, and many of them say yes. I said, why? Because something may happen to you tomorrow. That is why. But they will take insurance. But I said, this is your insurance. If you actually start investing today, that is your insurance for tomorrow. But we have to tell them of the possible scenarios and also the actions, the low-lying fruits and the long-term ones. So a lot of work has to go into actually making people aware, building their capacity, showing them things, telling them about the scenarios that are being built. So I think that is a very, very important part. The intention, again, is very important because, like you said, I mean, only when we recognize the problem will we take action. So, again, that I think is dependent on that awareness creation and capacity building, where in many places, they actually have started thinking. But again, if you look at the international scale, I think I attend a small program where Al Gore was actually conducting it. And he said he's not able to convince people in America that climate change is actually happening. So there are a whole lot of people who also are not convinced that all this is happening because of climate change. Now we say that, temperature has risen now so much. In the last 50 years, it has not happened. So people will say, but 50 years ago it happened. So that was not because of climate change. So there are a whole lot of people who are questioning this whole idea of climate change. And so convincing them that we need to change, we need to actually do things that are required, and actual training of where and what we can do. Because like you said, just saying, okay, climate change, let's build climate change into this means nothing. Where, what, how, and where will the money come from? I think these are all questions that need to be addressed, and that is when we can begin to have change.
Please, of course.
Take this into a conversation.
Of course, yeah, we'd love to do that.
I think Usha has raised some excellent points, and in fact, even in the first round, we got a lot, through the interventions. Usha, in a way, I agree with you. Just as with the economy, I feel our policymakers only focus their mind when there is a crisis. Similarly, with climate change or resilience, whichever way we want to look at it, a disaster should help us focus the mind. But I think awareness is very important, because very often disaster leads to solutions being offered which are coping mechanisms. They are not solutions, and we see that about air pollution in Delhi. Air pollution was mentioned, and how we will have even number cars on one day and another, or we'll stop construction for 3 days. That's not going to solve anything. And even in the case of the Chennai floods of 2015, where we had at the helm, a municipal commissioner who was among the best in the country, we invited him to come and speak at one of our Habitat Conversation series, but the focus was very much on coping. And the NGOs and civil society played a terrific role, even in coping. But, basically, I can't even blame them. When you get to know them and their problems, when you interact with them, these fellows are not empowered. They don't have funding. They are now trying to go into tertiary water treatment to get a little bit of money to attend to what they think are their priorities. And when you are living from hand to mouth, where is the time to think about long term? So I do think the pressure will have to come, and you've mentioned all of that, awareness on the part of the public, education of our political class, because today we are in an election mode. But how many times do you hear about air pollution, water contamination, public health crises? Because, the politicians are living in a different world, and they can do that because we are not letting them know that we understand the connect between your policies and public health and our vulnerabilities. So I do think that think tanks and civil society have a large role to play, because there are ways in which you can, when we say we must energize the slums, they can also be hijacked in populist measures. So, how do we spread this information and knowledge about what we are doing to the physical environment in which we live? And the second thing where I think people like us are to be blamed is that there is so much apathy on the part of the affluent classes, because they can find private solutions to public service failures. And now a time has come where, you may be able to get pure air by spending a huge amount within the char diwaris of, where you sleep, but you have to step out. And, there is no solution except a collective solution in which everybody is a stakeholder. So I really do think that awareness, information, and demand for good governance is as important as capacity building. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Those are very, very important. And the coping point that you made, absolutely on the dot. It doesn't go beyond that. So I'll give both of you an opportunity to respond or engage.
So I think as you were talking, I was just thinking about Chennai, because like I said, I'm doing a lot of work in Chennai. So 100RC provides support to the city to hire a chief resilience officer. So this is across the 100 cities for a few years, and for the city to come up with a resilience strategy. And the reason I say that is to your point about awareness. So in Chennai, we all will agree that there's an incredibly rich non-governmental, civil society, academic set of coalition, right? They're really fantastic if you start thinking about it. IIT Madras, you can name ITDPs there. So what we've done is through the strategy process, which is essentially an 1.5 to 2 year engagement, the chief resilience officer, who comes actually from an advertising background, so he's not an urban person, but he's he has come from a how do you influence behavior perspective, has brought in this coalition of people who are actually helping create the resilience strategy, which is really a master narrative. If you think about it, it's a master narrative of what resilience means to Chennai, and trying to articulate that in a way where government can start to say, okay, this makes sense. And as part of that, what are the interventions that are already happening, are getting recognized or are being recognized, and what else can the government or others do to build resilience? And resilience, the way we have always approached it, is a combination of stresses and shocks. So to your point about the coping mechanism after a disaster, I think we are also trying to make an argument that if you're looking at stresses, so water supply is a key stress in Chennai. Unplanned growth is a key stress in Chennai. And if you start to address those current stresses, you're building better resilience for the city to recover from a disaster. Right? So that's the argument we're trying to build. There's another, on your implementation part, I think, so the narrative becomes important. What is the narrative? And that's something we're trying to create. Linked to the stresses and shocks. So things the government is already doing, but making that into an argument for resilience gives them more confidence to say they're doing the right thing or to reach out to other funders. And for example, the World Bank is in conversation with Chennai to give a loan for housing. If we can help them articulate, you've got slums that are along the waterways. There's a government ambition to improve the waterways. How do you rehabilitate those slums? And if the World Bank is paying attention, then chances are it may get done in a slightly better way than maybe just evicting people, right? So finding those linkages and opportunities to. There's also experimentation, and I want to really highlight this one because we 100RC got a call from the Dutch government, and they have this gentleman called Henk Ovink. If you do a Google search for him, he's Mr. Water today. Like he goes around the world meeting all of the senior leadership, World Bank, UN, talking about climate resilience, and he's really a very enthusiastic gentleman. He's basically wanted to do a global competition, and we partnered with him, and Chennai is part of that, where the Dutch government has invested basically ran a global competition and said, let's look at water as a transformative force in the city. So to the point of, we look at land, let's look at water as a transformative force. He ran a global competition. There are certain teams selected. I'm actually very much integral to that as well, where these teams are not given a mandate to go solve a problem. They've been told, you look at the city, you understand the context, you understand what are the problem, and using water as the leverage, and it's called water as leverage, find what is the transformative opportunity here. And the team, it's brought on, the competition has brought international and local partners together. Each city, so there's 3 cities, each city has gotten 2 teams who are literally going and coming up with ideas. And I've seen some really fantastic stuff, to the point in Chennai, you know, they're looking at, the water bodies are threatened, clearly, right? I mean, because of the land pressure. And Chennai is growing at a very rapid rate. So the recognition is that, how do we protect these water bodies? You can put the regulation in place and don't build. That really may not solve the problem, as we've seen. So you say, okay, how do you allow development? How do you allow the market pressure for land to go there in a way where the water body is protected? So that's the kind of innovation that's they're looking at. Similarly, there are all these temple tanks in Chennai, right? Historically, temple tanks were all about water supply and flood mitigation, but we've lost that function. But yet that is integral to the fabric of the city even today, that water tank. So one team is looking at how do you renovate or restore it, you know, how do you bring back the water body, the water tanks, which has a huge cultural function, huge economic function, huge all of kinds of, you know, how do you bring it back in a way which is also serving that multiple, it's a flood water, because people can immediately see when the water is rising, there's a link to, oh, maybe there's, you know, precipitation. But it's